I will tell you how it started, because nobody else who was there that day seems to want to. Captain Dorothy Vell was drinking cold coffee in the command chair when Meridian Station's relay pushed the BM Kilo 7 alert through our comms queue. I know he was drinking cold coffee because I had brought it to him 17 minutes earlier, still hot, and he had set it down on the armrest without looking at it. That was a habit of his. Whenever we were between waypoints and there was nothing to watch but the slow drift of the outer marker buoys, he would accept a mug of coffee, set it on the armrest, and read the duty log until the coffee was cold. Then he would drink it. I had served aboard ECV Harrow's Keep for 11 months by that point, and I had never once seen the man drink hot coffee. I was running my standard diagnostic sweep on the atmospheric recyclers. The portside secondary exchanger had been throwing a minor variance flag for 3 days, and I was logging it for the repair manifest at care of Anchorage when the alert tone sounded. Not the general alarm. The soft tone, the one that meant something had queued in the comm stack that the system had flagged as requiring officer attention, but hadn't risen to the level of sounding klaxons. I looked up from the panel. Petty Officer Cale Vorn at the comm station was already leaning forward, pulling the message header into the main display. "Captain," Vorn said, "we've got a relay forward from Meridian Station." Captain Vell set down his cold coffee. "What frequency?" "BM Kilo 7, sir." Vorn paused. I could hear him pulling the classification record. "That's a Colonial Biosafety Authority monitoring band. Earth designation. According to the registry, it's been on passive sweep status for another pause longer, 94 years. The captain was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't understand what he's heard. The quiet of a man who does and is deciding what to do with it. "What's the source?" Kethrani Automated Quarantine Beacon. Origin transponder tags a biosafety containment transport, KBV Sarath uncontained, according to the signal header. She's in low orbit over care of Anchorage. Beacon's been broadcasting broadband emergency on about 43 frequencies simultaneously. Vorn turned in his seat. "Looks like she hit every emergency band in the registry, active or not. BM Kilo 7 was apparently on the list." "Care of Anchorage." The captain pulled the navigation display. I could see it from where I was standing, the waypoint station we were 3 hours out from, the one we'd been crawling toward for the last 6 hours with a full manifest of cargo inspections waiting for us. How far out from them? 2 hours 50 minutes at current speed, 2 hours 10 at full ahead. And the nearest Kethrani biosafety response vessel. Vorn worked that for a moment. "Closest one I'm showing is a Kethrani Containment Authority ship, KCAS Veteran Protocol. She's 9 hours out from the Sarath's position. There's a Kethrani patrol corvette closer, about 4 hours, but she's not rated for biosafety containment work." I watched the captain stare at the navigation plot. He had the look I had learned to recognize over 11 months, the look that meant he was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. "What do we know about the situation aboard the Sarath?" he asked. "The quarantine beacon is automatic, sir. No crew-originated voice traffic in the relay package. Meridian Station's been trying to raise the Sarath on standard comms since they forwarded the beacon. No response." Captain Vell reached over and picked up his cold coffee and drank it. Then he set the mug down. "Marin," he said, without turning around. "Sir." "You still hold your CBA cross-certification?" I stood up from the recycler panel. "Lapsed, sir. I did the basic containment module 4 years ago for the Frontier Auxiliary Program. I was never rated for active response." "But you know the protocols." "I know the theory." I paused. "The manual says that's not the same thing." "The manual was written by someone who wasn't 2 hours from a Kethrani biosafety vessel with no response and no crew traffic." He turned the chair toward me. "We are not equipped for this, specialist. We don't have containment suits rated above Class 3. We have one biosafety kit. which I believe was restocked 18 months ago and is probably missing 2 items. We are a patrol corvette on a waypoint run, and we have no business anywhere near an active quarantine situation." He let that sit for a moment. "We're also the closest vessel to that beacon by 4 hours." I didn't say anything. "Vorn, raise care of Anchorage. Let them know we're diverting and ask them to push any intel they have on the Sarath's last logged status. Then push a situation report to Sector Command and request them to expedite the KCAS Veteran Protocol. Full ahead." He stood up from the chair. "Marin, get the biosafety kit from storage and read me what's actually in it." We went to full ahead. The biosafety kit had 17 of its 22 standard components. The 3 rebreather filters that were supposed to be in the lower tray were missing, which meant 2 of our Class 3 suits were functional and 1 was not. We had a biohazard containment foam applicator with 1 canister. The second canister slot was empty. We had a basic biological screening unit that could detect Class 1 through Class 4 contamination signatures, which I did not find reassuring, because a Kethrani quarantine situation would likely involve organisms classified well above that baseline. We had no Class 5 or Class 6 containment materials at all. What we had beyond that was 2 rolls of emergency isolation tape, a set of atmospheric sampling probes, a decontamination spray unit rated for secondary surface exposure, and a manual printed in 4 languages including, I noticed without any particular emotion, the Galactic Common variant that was current 80 years ago. I reported all of this to Captain Vell. He listened without expression. 3 crew suited up, he said. "You, Petty Officer Cale Vorn and Senior Technician Das Haverin. I'll remain aboard to coordinate and handle any Kethrani liaison when they arrive. Lieutenant Commander Esev will hold the ship." He looked at me steadily. "I need you to understand something, Marin. We are not going over there to complete a biosafety containment operation. We are not equipped to do that. We are going over there to stabilize whatever we find, extract any surviving Kethrani crew, and hold the situation until the Veteran Protocol arrives." "Understood, sir." "If what we find is beyond our ability to stabilize, we extract and we seal the docking collar and we wait. Clear?" "Clear, sir." "One more thing," he said this quietly. "There's a detonation provision in the Kethrani Biosafety Protocol for full containment failure. If what we find tells you that the situation is unrecoverable, I need to know before I make that call. I'm not making it without your eyes on the problem." He met my eyes. "You have the only biosafety certification on this ship, lapsed or otherwise. Your read is the read I'm going to use." I understood what he was telling me. I understood it fully, and I did not say anything except "Yes, sir," because that was the right answer and also the only one I had. What we found was not beyond our ability to stabilize, but it came close enough that years later I still wake up some nights and lie there in the dark and think about the middle 3 hours when it nearly went the other way. Care of Anchorage pushed us a status packet on the Sarath 40 minutes into our approach. KBV Sarath Uncontained was a mid-range Kethrani biosafety containment transport, licensed to carry up to 12 containment units, crew of 8, operating under the authority of the Kethrani Biosafety Authority as a mobile transfer vessel for live specimen containment. Her last logged status, filed from care of Anchorage's traffic control 18 hours before our diversion, had been routine. Inbound from the Sarath Station Waypoint Cluster, carrying 6 active containment units, crew of 8, no anomalies. The nature of what was in those containment units was not in the public traffic log. That was standard Kethrani biosafety protocol. You didn't broadcast what you were carrying, just that you were carrying it, and that the containment was nominal. The containment was no longer nominal. I spent the remaining hour and 40 minutes of the approach reading everything care of Anchorage's packet contained, and everything else I could find in Harrow's keeps general database on Kethrani biosafety vessels and their containment protocols. This was not a large amount of information. Kethrani Biosafety Containment was a classified domain, and our database had the public-facing summary documents and a general engineering overview from a cross-species safety cooperation agreement that was 9 years old. I read all of it. I also read, for the third time in my career, the Colonial Biosafety Authority's Standard Containment Procedures Manual, the one that came with the Biosafety Kit, the one printed in 80-year-old Galactic Common, the one that was the theoretical foundation for my lapsed certification. I read it not because I expected it to tell me anything directly applicable to what I was about to walk into, but because I needed to be thinking about the right category of problem. Havern found me in the storage bay when I was pulling the Class 3 suits out for pre-check. He was a senior technician, 3 years my senior in service, calm in a way that was not blankness, but rather a kind of steady professional processing, the way some people have of neither amplifying nor suppressing what they are dealing with, just holding it at a workable level. He started checking the second suit while I was checking the first. "You've done this before?" he asked. "Training module 4 years ago, never operationally. But you know the theory." That's what the captain said. He thought about that for a moment, working the suit collar seal to test it. "Good enough," he said finally. That was Havern. He didn't say it dismissively. He said it the way you say something when you have assessed the situation and reached a conclusion, and the conclusion is that good enough is, in fact, good enough. Vorn arrived shortly after and we went through the suits together, the three of us, checking each component against the kit manifest, accounting for what was missing, discussing how to compensate. Vorn was 23 and this was his second tour, and he had a quality that I valued enormously in that hour. He asked good questions and did not ask more of them than the situation required. When I explained that the biosafety screening unit topped out at Class 4 contamination signatures, and that we might be dealing with something above that threshold, he asked what we should watch for that the unit might not catch. I gave him the honest answer, which was that a Class 5 or above contamination signature often presented with atmospheric trace markers that human sensory detection could register before a Class 4 scanner flagged them, and that the specific markers I had read about in the manual were a combined chemical and biological trace that had no exact human language analog, but was frequently described as organic and chemical together, in a way that triggered an instinctive warning response. He thought about that for a moment and said, "So trust your nose." "Trust your nose," I said. We finished the suit checks in silence. When we were done, the three of us stood in the storage bay with the suits on, the biosafety kit staged on the bench, the foam applicator in my right hand, and nobody said anything for a moment. It was not the silence of people who were afraid, or at least, if it was also the silence of people who were done with the business of preparation and had nothing left to do until the docking collar locked. Havern looked at the foam applicator. He said, "1 canister." He was not asking, just nodding. "If we use it well, it'll be enough." He said this with the same quality he had used when he said good enough earlier, not as a reassurance, not as a performance of confidence, but as a factual conclusion. I believed him when he said it, which may have been optimistic and may have been right, and turned out to be both simultaneously, which is the way those things often go. When we came into visual range, I could see from the sensor returns that the Serath had lost attitude control. She was in a slow tumble, not dramatic, maybe 4 degrees of roll per minute, but enough to tell me that no one aboard was at the helm. Her running lights were on. Her quarantine beacon was broadcasting on all 43 frequencies, pulsing on the 2-second interval that the registry listed as the Kethrani automated priority signal. On the ship's exterior, I could see 2 sections of the hull where the emergency venting system had fired thin crystallized gas plumes, already dispersed in orbit, marking where the ship had automatically released internal pressure from isolated compartments. The venting locations were aft, in the section of the hull that corresponded, roughly, to where I would have expected the cargo section to be on a transport of this class. That told me the containment breach was in the cargo section. That was almost certainly the right part of the ship to have a containment breach. It did not make me feel better. Lieutenant Commander Esev brought us in carefully. The docking collar approach took 20 minutes because the Sarath's tumble meant we had to match her rotation before we could extend the collar, and matching a slow tumble with a stationary patrol corvette requires a degree of finesse that I was glad Esev had. I watched her work it from the forward station. 2 attempts to match the rotation, the first close but not close enough, the second locked, the collar extending and finding the Sarath's docking port, and the mechanical clamps engaging with a sound that came through the hull as a heavy satisfying thunk. Pressure equalization ran through the docking tube. The tone sounded that said atmospheres were compatible for unprotected transit. We were already in our Class 3 suits. I went in first, because I was the one with the lapsed biosafety certification, and I was the one who had spent the approach reading the containment manual for the 3rd time in my career. That was what I had. Lapsed theory and recent review, and the understanding that neither of those things was what the manual called sufficient, and that the manual had been written for a situation where sufficient was possible. Vorn and Haverin were behind me. Captain Vell's voice was in my earpiece, clear and steady. "Report as you go, Marin, don't rush." The docking tube opened into the Sarath's forward transit corridor. Emergency lighting was on, a deep amber tone, different from our own ship's emergency red, and I remember thinking that the amber was somehow worse, just an aesthetic impression that had no basis in anything logical but stayed with me anyway. The corridor was about 2 meters wide, smooth-walled, with equipment bays on both sides. The design was clearly functional rather than habitation optimized, all straight lines and flush panels, the kind of interior that says the ship was built to carry things rather than people. It smelled. Even through the suit's filters I could tell it smelled wrong, the kind of wrong that registers before you can identify it, organic and chemical together in a combination that the human brain files under the category of warnings without waiting for instructions. Vorn behind me said nothing, but I heard his breathing change slightly. Nothing was moving in the corridor. That was the first thing I registered. The corridor was empty, and that was both good and bad. Good because whatever had happened hadn't fully taken the transit areas. Bad because the emptiness felt like something that had been cleared rather than something that had always been clear. "Forward transit corridor clear," I said into the earpiece, proceeding toward the crew stations. We moved forward. The Kethrani vessel's corridor layout was close enough to human ship design that navigation was not the problem I had feared. The primary corridor ran fore to aft with lateral branches at regular intervals, the crew station forward and the cargo section aft, which was consistent with every containment transport design I had read about regardless of species. I moved at a pace that was not rushing, but was not cautious beyond the basic caution of moving through an unknown environment with potentially hostile biological agents at large. There was a version of this where I crept from doorway to doorway, and a version where I walked normally and watched carefully. And I had decided before boarding that the second version was better. Slow movement makes noise, makes you read more threat into ambient sound, makes it harder to hear what needs hearing. We found the first crew member before we reached the crew station, a Kethrani technician, ID badge identifying them as Systems Monitor 3rd Grade Veteran OS, collapsed in the corridor outside the secondary access ladder. Alive. Unconscious, breathing shallow, no visible external injuries, but their environmental suit. Kethrani crew wore lightweight environmental suits, as standard on a biosafety transport, designed for atmosphere compatibility rather than full containment, had a section of the collar torn open. The torn collar was the relevant detail. It meant exposure. I ran the biosafety scanner over Veteran OS. The unit gave me a reading I was not fully equipped to interpret. The Kethrani biological baseline was not in its standard library, which meant the contamination signature it was detecting was being compared against human norms rather than Kethrani norms. but it registered a Class 3 contamination marker, and that much I could interpret. Real exposure, not acute, but real and requiring medical attention. I told Vorn to stay with Veteran Os and work out how to move them toward the docking tube without compromising their suit further. I gave him the isolation tape from the kit. He looked at the torn collar and at the tape and nodded without saying anything and started working. Havarin and I went up the access ladder. The crew station was a compartment about the size of Harrow's Keep's main hold, with a central command console, 6 workstations arranged in an arc behind it, and a wide forward viewport that looked out over the Sarath's bow. Through the viewport, I could see the slow wheel of the starfield as the ship's tumble continued. The planet below, the small blue-brown sphere of whatever world care of anchorage orbited, rotated through the frame every 15 seconds, which I found briefly, inappropriately hypnotic, and then I stopped looking at the viewport. 3 Kethrani crew members were at the command console. 2 of them were not alive. I won't describe the specifics of how I knew that and how I confirmed it. I confirmed it methodically and filed the confirmation in the part of my brain that holds things for processing later, and I moved on. The 3rd was alive. Her name, I learned later, was Thareth Voss. She was the Sarath's transport commander, the equivalent of a captain, and she was alive because she had managed to get her suit collar sealed after the event, and because she had wedged herself into the gap between the primary command console and the forward viewport housing, and because she was, as I would also learn later, extremely stubborn. She had been in that gap for, according to the ship's log timestamp on the last manual entry, which was visible on one of the still-active console screens, 6 hours and 40 minutes. She had been awake for at least part of that time because there were 3 manual log entries after the initial quarantine beacon fired, each increasingly brief, each ending with the same notation in Kethrani script that the translating function on the console rendered as Containment Authority Notified. Awaiting response. The last entry had been made 4 hours ago. When I found her, she was conscious, and she was staring at me with an expression I did not know how to read. Not fear, I am sure it wasn't fear, and I've thought about it enough times since to be confident in that. It was something more measured, the expression of a person who has been through something and has arrived on the other side of it with their ability to assess still intact and is using it. She said something in Kethrani. I had no translator. ECV Harrow's Keep carried standard galactic common language packs and the 4 most common alien language modules, and Kethrani was the 7th most common, which put it outside our standard loadout. I hadn't even tried to find a workaround for that on the flight over because I had been reading the containment manual, and because there was no good workaround. You either have the module or you don't. I did the only thing I could do. I said in Galactic Common, I'm Specialist Adele Marin, ECV Harrow's Keep Earth Patrol Service. We received your quarantine beacon. We're here. She stared at me. I watched her process the sentence, confirm the language register, and shift into it. Her Galactic Common, when she spoke, was accented but entirely functional. You are not Kethrani Biosafety Authority, she said. No, I said. We're not. We're the closest vessel to your position. The KBA response ship is 9 hours out. 9 hours. She said it with the flatness of someone making a precise calculation, not with distress. The containment breach is in the cargo section. 3 units are compromised. 2 of the specimens are uncontained. She paused for a fraction of a second, the pause of someone deciding how much detail is appropriate to this specific conversation. I have been attempting to seal the cargo section access manually from this station for the last several hours. I do not have the crew capacity left to do it. I cannot do it from here. Tell me what we're dealing with, I said. The specimens, what are they? She told me. She told me in precise, measured galactic common what was in the 3 compromised containment units. The Kethrani Biosafety Authority's classification system uses a numerical scale with letter subcategories, and the specimens in the compromised units sat at a level on that scale that I had no direct equivalent for in my training, but that I could map, by her description of the relevant risk factors, to what Earth's colonial biosafety authority would have called a Tier 5 plus, organisms that require specialized transport, specialized containment protocols, and that under no circumstances should be addressed by personnel without specific training in the relevant biological category. I had specific training in Tier 1 through Tier 3. 4 years ago, theoretical lapsed. I reported this to Captain Vell in my earpiece, as accurately and as quickly as I could. I gave him what Thareth Voss had told me, translated into the closest Earth-equivalent classification I could determine, and I gave him the count: 2 uncontained, 1 in a compromised unit with weakening seals. There was a pause on the line, not long. When he spoke, it was in the same tone he had used for every instruction since we had gone to full ahead, calm, precise, and fully present. Marin, the 3rd unit, the compromised one with the weakening seals, how long before it fails fully? I relayed the question to Thareth Voss. She had a screen at the command console still functioning, and she pulled the unit's telemetry feed. She looked at it for a moment and said something to herself in Kethrani quietly that I think was not a calculation. Then, the seal degradation rate is variable, based on current readings, less than 4 hours, perhaps significantly less. There is a manual emergency reseal sequence that can be executed at the unit itself, but it requires familiarity with the unit design. Can you do it? Yes, she said. I was trained on this unit type. I told the captain all of that. Another pause, then, all right, here is what we're going to do. What Captain Vell told me we were going to do was this: clear any surviving crew from the accessible areas of the ship, get them back through the docking collar to Harrow's Keep and into medical observation, and then enter the cargo section with Thareth Voss to perform the emergency reseal on the 3rd unit, and attempt to locate and contain the 2 free specimens. He said it without inflection, which is the way you say things that are difficult when you need them to remain executable. Understood, I said. 1 note, sir. My foam applicator 1 canister. If we have 2 free specimens, a single canister may not be sufficient. Copy that. Do what you can with it. The protocol is being expedited. I've been in contact with Sector Command, and they've pushed an emergency relay to the protocol's captain. They're running at maximum speed. ETA is being revised downward from 9 hours. It won't be a large revision, but it's something. Understood. Thareth Voss, when I told her the plan, said she was going into the cargo section with us. I told her she had been in a sealed gap for nearly 7 hours, and that the physical toll of that, combined with the suit exposure she had likely received before she sealed the collar, made this a medical question first. She told me the emergency reseal sequence required familiarity with the unit design, that I did not have that familiarity, and that the foam applicator in my biosafety kit used a compound that was compatible with the relevant biology, but not with the containment unit's own sealing foam, which meant that if I accidentally applied it to the wrong surface during the reseal, I would compromise rather than assist the seal, and that therefore my ability to complete the reseal without her guidance was functionally 0. She was right. I told her she was right. She came. We moved Vethran Os and 2 other surviving Kethrani crew members, a navigator named Sareth Dan, and an environmental monitor named Das Kor, both of whom we found in the secondary crew berthing compartment adjacent to the crew station, both in worse condition than Voss, both conscious, back through the docking corridor to Harrow's Keep. Lieutenant Commander Esev had set up the ship's medical bay as well as it could be set up, which was not brilliantly, given that Harrow's Keep's medical bay was designed for a crew of 12 and was currently operating at the edge of its supply capacity with 3 non-human patients. But Esev had also pulled Harrow's Keep's general medical database's Kethrani physiology module. We did have that one. It came standard with the galactic species cross-compatibility package, and she worked from it with competent improvisation. The 3 Kethrani crew members were stable. That was what we needed. The cargo section. To reach it from the crew station, you went back down the access ladder, aft along the main corridor, through a Class 2 pressure door, and then down another corridor to a second pressure door that was the cargo section boundary. The Class 2 door was intact and sealed, its amber status light glowing steadily, which in the Kethrani protocol meant secure, not breached, not compromised, just sealed as a standard measure. The cargo section boundary door was open. Not broken, not forced, simply open. Someone had been through it last, and had either not been able to close it behind them, or had chosen not to, which told me something about the nature of the urgency that had been involved. Thareth Voss said, without any particular emotion as we stood at the open door, 2 crew members came through here to attempt manual containment. They did not come back through. She was quiet for a moment. They were thorough people. I did not say anything. She had already processed that. I could tell by the quality of her stillness that she had processed it a long time ago, in the gap behind the command console, and that what she was doing now was not processing but acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement and processing are different things, and she did not need me to help with either. We went through the open door. The cargo section was 2.5 times the size of Harrow's Keep's main hold. The 12 containment unit bays were arranged in 2 rows of 6 along the cargo section's main axis, with a central work corridor between them. 6 of the bays were occupied. The containment units themselves were large rectangular chambers, about 2 meters by 3 by 2, sealed with interlocking panel systems, and instrumented along the top with readout strips that showed. In a color code, I had to ask Thareth Voss to translate on the fly. Unit status, containment integrity, atmosphere inside the unit, and the basic biological baseline of whatever the unit contained. 3 units had gone from whatever their nominal status color was to amber, and then, for the worst of the 3, to red. The red unit's readout strip was giving numbers that Thareth Voss read at a glance and translated as seals at 41% nominal integrity, internal atmosphere partially equalized with the cargo section atmosphere, containment status degraded but not failed. That was the 3rd unit, the one we needed to reseal before it failed completely. The 2 free specimens were somewhere in the cargo section. I could not see them. The overhead equipment track ran the full length of the cargo section. It was a crane and mover system for positioning the heavy containment units, with housing that ran along both inner walls above the first row unit tops. There was enough space in that housing for something to conceal itself. There was also the gap between the unit rows at floor level, and the space beneath the units where the support frames created an access crawl, and the aft walls ventilation and hull access panel housings. I noted all of this. I noted that the cargo section smelled worse than the transit corridor, the same organic chemical combination but stronger, enough that even through the Class 3 suit I was registering it. I noted that the emergency lighting through shadows from the unit corners that moved as the ship's slow tumble shifted the starlight angle through the cargo section's 2 small viewports. I noted all of this and I kept moving. Thareth Voss went directly to the red status unit without looking at the unit bays she passed. She had a purpose and she was pursuing it. That was right. Haverin positioned himself at the aft end of the corridor, watching the back of the section. I positioned myself at the forward end between the door and the central corridor, and I ran the biosafety scanner down the row of units, watching the readouts, watching the overhead. "Marin," Haverin said quietly from the aft end. I turned. He had found it, or rather it had found him. I will not describe the specimen in the detail that the incident report contains. What I will say is that it came from the overhead track housing at the 40-minute mark, while Haverin was checking the status readouts on the second compromised unit, and that he had enough time to see it and enough time to get his arm up and enough time to shout one syllable, not a word, just a sound, sharp and involuntary, before it was on him. He did not go down. He was still standing when I reached him, And that mattered because a standing target is a different problem than a prone one. I applied the foam. The applicator was designed to be operated by someone with specific training in its use, and what I had was the theory. The theory said, coat the organism's contact surface thoroughly and rapidly. The compound immobilizes on contact and begins the chemical neutralization process within seconds, but incomplete application will allow the organism to free itself before the compound sets. The theory was written for human-scale organisms, and this organism was not human-scale, and the angle was wrong, and Havaren's arm was in the way, and Thareth Voss appeared beside me without my having heard her move from the red status unit and said, in galactic common, precisely and without raising her voice, "Left side. The contact surface. Cover the contact surface." I covered the contact surface. The foam set. The organism stopped moving. Thareth Voss stepped back and looked at what we had and said, still without raising her voice, "It will hold. The compound is compatible. It will hold." The report uses the word incapacitated. That is accurate. The specifics of his injuries are in the medical section of the report, filed by the care of Anchorage medical team, and I am not going to describe them here beyond saying that he was incapacitated, but he was alive and he was conscious, and he asked me, as I helped him to a position against the unit bay wall where he would be out of the active area, whether the foam had held. I told him yes. He said, "Good. That's the one thing." That was Havaren. I called Vorn forward from the docking tube. He arrived in 3 minutes, which was faster than I expected, and I did not ask him how fast he had moved through the corridor. He looked at Havaren, looked at the contained specimen, and looked at me. I told him the situation. 1 specimen contained, 1 specimen still free in the cargo section, 1 foam canister at approximately 40% remaining, and the 3rd unit still needing its reseal sequence completed. Thareth Voss said, without preamble, "The 3rd unit first. If the seal fails while we are still locating the 2nd specimen, the situation becomes significantly more difficult. We reseal the unit. Then we locate." She was right. The captain and my earpiece agreed. We did the 3rd unit first. The emergency reseal sequence took 22 minutes. I held the tools she asked for and followed her specific instructions for each step. Vorn monitored the unit's external instrumentation and called the readings at 30-second intervals. Not because Thareth Voss needed the prompting, but because having someone external call the readings gives you a second confirmation of what the unit is doing when you are focused on what your hands are doing, which is procedure even when the person calling the readings doesn't fully understand what they mean. I understood what the numbers meant at the level of higher is better for integrity, lower is worse, and the numbers were moving in the right direction, slowly, and then faster, and then the readout strip shifted from red to amber and held there. Amber, not green. Sealed, not restored. The unit needed the KBA team's full certification to be back in nominal operating status, but sealed was what we needed right now, and sealed was what we had. "It will hold until the protocol arrives," Thareth Voss said, "but it must not be moved." Understood. We found the 2nd specimen at the 2-hour 10-minute mark. It was in the aft of the cargo section, near the hull access panel, and it was smaller than the first. Thareth Voss had told me this during her initial briefing at the crew station, and I had logged it, and it was true. And I want to note for anyone reading this that smaller is a relative term, and does not mean what it sounds like it means in the context of the cargo section of a Kethrani biosafety transport, with 40% of 1 foam canister remaining. What it meant in practice was that the application problem was different from the first specimen. A smaller contact surface meant a higher risk of incomplete coverage with a single pass, and a higher ratio of organism mobility relative to the foam coverage speed. Thareth Voss had anticipated this. She positioned herself to the organism's aft, which created a direction of movement toward me rather than away, and she said, "When it moves, apply to the dorsal surface first. Do not lead with the ventral side. The compound absorbs differently on the ventral surface and will take longer to set. Dorsal surface first, I said. It moved. I applied the foam. It was sufficient. When the KCAS Veteran Protocol docked alongside the Seraph 3 hours and 12 minutes after we had entered the cargo section, the situation they found was 2 specimens contained with emergency foam in the cargo section, the 3rd containment unit sealed but not restored, the 4th, 5th, and 6th units intact and nominal, 3 Kethrani crew members in the Earth Patrol, Corvette's medical bay in stable condition, 1 Earth crew member in the same medical bay with injuries that the report categorizes as serious, and 2 Kethrani crew members dead. 2 Kethrani crew members who had been dead for more than 6 hours before we arrived. We had not saved everyone. We arrived 9 hours before the KBA response ship. We did not save everyone. I have turned that over more times than I can count, and I have arrived at a place with it that is not peace exactly, but is something I can carry. The 2 Kethrani crew members who died had died before our docking collar locked onto the Seraph. They were gone before Meridian Station forwarded the beacon, before Captain Vell put down his cold coffee, before we went a full ahead. There was nothing we could have done for them. I know this. I have had medical officers tell me this plainly, and I believe them. And the belief doesn't entirely close the file, but it makes the file manageable. What we could do, we did. The protocols team was efficient and thorough and had everything we had not had. Watching them move through the cargo section, properly equipped with the right tools and the right training and the right suits, was an education in what we should have been. They were not critical of what we had done. The protocol's team leader, a Kethrani Biosafety response officer named Veteran Corps, no relation to the crew member of the same name, examined our containment work on both specimens with the specific attention of someone looking for errors, and said, in clipped galactic common, that the application was adequate, which I understood to mean it had worked and they weren't going to have to redo it, and I took that as the highest compliment available under the circumstances. I was in the docking collar access, between the Seraph and Harrow's Keep, when Thareth Voss came to find me. The protocol's team had been aboard for nearly 2 hours by that point and had cleared her and the 2 other surviving crew members for movement. She had changed into a fresh environmental suit. The protocol had brought spares, and she was moving under her own power, which I had expected, because she had been moving under her own power through the cargo section for 2 hours before the protocol arrived, and that did not seem like the kind of capacity that departed quickly. She stood in the docking collar access and looked at me. The Veteran Protocol's commander tells me you received our quarantine beacon through a relay station, she said. An Earth relay station, a biosafety monitoring channel. Meridian Station, I said. They run BM Kilo 7. It's a Colonial Biosafety Authority frequency. It was last actively used 94 years ago, before I was born, before my parents were born, but no one ever issued a deactivation order, so the station kept running the sweep. She was quiet for a moment. The amber emergency lighting of the Seraph was still on at the docking collar access, and it lit the side of her face in a way that showed every line of how tired she was without diminishing the quality of attention she was paying to what I was saying. We filed our beacon on broadband emergency, she said. 43 frequencies. I did not know BM Kilo 7 was on the broadband registry. It was added in the original registry build, I said, before the Colonial Biosafety Authority was dissolved and its functions transferred to the Frontier Auxiliary. Someone put it on the list in case the channel was ever needed, and then the channel stopped being needed and the list was never updated. Meridian Station just kept running it. And you came. We were the closest vessel. She looked at me for a long time. The Kethrani face does not do what a human face does for an expression. The musculature and the structure are different enough that mapping human expressions onto Kethrani physiognomy is not reliable, and I try not to do it. What I can say is that what was on her face was neither gratitude nor something that looked like distress. It was that measuring quality I had first seen when I found her behind the command console, the expression of someone assessing carefully with full faculties. "I want to say something clearly," she said. "Your crew was not equipped for this. The suits you wore were inadequate by 2 classification levels. The biological screening equipment you had was insufficient for the specific organisms involved. You did not have the correct containment foam volume. You had 1 crew member with a lapsed certification at the relevant level and 2 crew members with no relevant training whatsoever. Your ship's database did not contain the Kethrani language module." She said all of this without accusation and without irony, the way you recite the facts of a situation when you want to be certain that both parties are working from the same facts. "And you came anyway." "We were the closest vessel," I said for the second time. I was aware that this was my recurring answer, and that it was not a complete answer and that she knew it. "Haveran," she began. "He'll recover. He was injured because he was aboard this vessel. Because you answered a quarantine beacon, you had no obligation to answer on a frequency that by any reasonable reading should have been decommissioned before my ship launched." "Yes," I said. "I am not able to tell you how to weigh that," she said. "I do not know your protocols for those determinations. What I can tell you is that without your intervention, the 3rd unit would have failed before the protocol arrived. The situation in the cargo section would have been different from what the protocol found. The surviving crew aboard this ship would have been—" She paused, and it was the first pause I had heard from her that was not the pause of someone choosing words for precision, but the pause of someone deciding whether to say a true thing aloud. "Different," she said. I nodded. "You did not aim this frequency at us," I said. "You didn't aim your beacon at Earth. You fired on broadband and hit a channel that has been dormant since before either of us was born, and a 2-person outpost caught the signal because nobody ever told them to stop listening." I paused. "We came because we were close. We did what we could with what we had." She was quiet again. Then she said, "The 3rd unit, the emergency reseal sequence. How much of it did you understand while I was directing you?" "About 30%, I said honestly. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile. I have already said I try not to map human expressions onto Kethrani faces, but an acknowledgement, something in the eyes, something that recognized a shared specific fact. "I understood approximately 20% of what you were doing with the foam applicator during the 2nd specimen containment, but the foam held and the animal was immobilized." "It did," I said. She nodded once, the precise acknowledgement I had seen throughout the cargo section, the nod that meant, "Confirmed, proceeding." Then she turned and went back toward the Serath's interior. I went back through the docking collar to Harrow's Keep. We undocked from the Serath 4 hours later, once the protocols team had confirmed the cargo section stable, and the 3 Kethrani crew members in our medical bay had been safely transferred to the protocol's medical section. I sat with Haveran for part of that wait. He was awake, uncomfortable, not happy about any of the specifics of his situation, but awake and talking, which was what mattered. He asked me what the 2nd specimen had looked like, and I told him, and he said he was glad he had only seen the 1st one, and that was probably true. He asked me whether the protocols team had said anything about our containment work, and I told him what Veteran Corps had said, adequate, and his expression said that he found that as satisfying as I had. When we cast off, I went up to the command deck. Captain Vell was at the navigation station, not the command chair, working on the incident report. The coffee mug was on the console beside him. I could not tell whether it was hot or cold. "How is he?" the captain asked without looking up. "Stable. He'll need the Anchorage medical facility, but he'll be all right." "Good." He finished a line of the report and looked up at me. "You did well in there, Marin." "We were the closest vessel," I said. I was aware I had said it again. It had become the answer I gave when I didn't have a better one, which was not because the better answer didn't exist, but because I hadn't finished finding it yet. He looked at me for a moment. "That's true," he said. "It's also not the whole answer, and you know it." He was right. The whole answer included 11 months of environmental systems work on a patrol corvette that had, somewhere in its equipment bay, a biosafety kit that was missing 3 components. It included 4 years ago a lapsed certification that I had completed as a side requirement for a program I never finished. It included a 2-person outpost named Meridian Station that had been running a passive frequency sweep for 94 years because nobody had told them to stop. It included a Kethrani transport commander who could execute an emergency reseal sequence in a compromised cargo section while directing 2 humans who had never seen the unit design before, at 30% comprehension on our end of the transaction. It included a second crew member who was adequate with a foam applicator he had never trained on, and a third who could hold an access corridor and call instrument readings with no prior biosafety experience. The whole answer was not a simple thing. The captain went back to the incident report. I found a seat at one of the aft stations and began writing my section of it, the Environmental Systems Specialist's After Action, covering technical observations and equipment performance. I wrote it honestly. The Class 3 suits had been adequate for the conditions we encountered. The biosafety screening unit had been inadequate for the specific contamination signatures involved, and this limitation should be noted for future patrol kit reviews. The foam applicator had been appropriate in type, but a single canister had been insufficient for the potential scope of the operation, and future kit configuration should include a minimum of 2 canisters. The Class 2 pressure door had held throughout the operation, and its integrity had been a significant factor in limiting the contamination zone. I also wrote that frequency BM Kilo 7 had performed its intended function, routing a broadband biosafety emergency signal to an Earth response asset, and that the 94 years of dormancy had not prevented that function from operating correctly. I wrote that Meridian Station had flagged and forwarded the alert through the appropriate chain with correct protocol. I wrote that a formal status review of the frequency was recommended, including whether to reactivate it in the Kethrani Biosafety Emergency Broadcast Registry as an additional monitoring pathway. That last line turned out to be consequential. 6 weeks after the Sarath incident, the Colonial Biosafety Authority's successor organization within the Frontier Auxiliary completed a review and issued an order reactivating BM Kilo 7 as an active monitoring channel. It was added formally to the Kethrani Biosafety Authority's Emergency Broadcast Registry, giving it bilateral recognition for the first time. Meridian Station received an official commendation and a hardware upgrade to its monitoring equipment, which I understand the 2-person team there found enormously gratifying after 94 years of essentially unremarked operation. The KCAS Veteran Protocol's After-Action Report included a recommendation from the protocol commander that contributed to the review decision. I was told, informally, that Thareth Voss had also said something during her debriefing by the Kethrani Biosafety Authority that had been noted by the reviewing officers. I don't know exactly what she said because the debriefing was classified at the Kethrani end, but the recommendation went through. Havarin was in the care of Anchorage Medical Facility for 11 days. I visited every day that Harrow's Keep was docked for repairs and resupply, which was 6 of the 11 days, and I sent messages on the other 5. He was fine. I want to be clear about that, and I want it to be the lasting note rather than the other description. He was injured, he healed, he went back to his duties. He still tells the story of the Sarath. I know because I have heard him tell it, at care of Anchorage and later at the patrol station at Verath Point, and the version he tells is different from the version I tell, which is right. He was inside the cargo section too, and what he makes of it belongs to him. He always starts from the moment the first specimen came down from the overhead track. I always start from the moment Meridian Station forwarded the alert, because that's where it started for me, not in the cargo section. In the command deck with cold coffee on the armrest and a soft alert tone, and a channel that had been listening for 94 years without anyone asking it to stop. The Sarath's quarantine beacon had gone out on 43 frequencies to find whoever was listening. BM Kilo 7 was listening. We were close. Havarin's version of the story, when he tells it at Verath Point, ends with him saying that the thing that surprises him still, when he thinks about it, is the arithmetic. He means, the KBA response ship was 9 hours out. The situation was not survivable for 9 more hours without intervention. The fact that an Earth Patrol corvette happened to be 2 hours out, with a crew member who had done exactly the right training 4 years ago and never completed the program, is the kind of thing that looks like luck until you think about it long enough and realize it's not luck. It's arithmetic. Enough ships in enough places running enough waypoint runs means that when a dormant frequency catches a signal nobody aimed at it, there's a reasonable probability that the closest vessel has someone aboard who has done, at some point, some version of the relevant preparation, even if lapsed, even if incomplete. I think he's right. I also think some of it really was luck, and that the two things are not mutually exclusive. What I know is this. Thareth Voss asked me in the docking collar access why we came. I gave her the truest single-sentence answer I had. We were the closest vessel. That was true. It was also not the whole answer, and the captain was right that I knew it. The whole answer is that Meridian Station ran a frequency sweep for 94 years because nobody told it to stop. The Sarath's automated beacon went out on broadband and hit that frequency. Vorn pulled the message header and said the frequency had been dormant for 94 years, and Captain Vell heard that and did the arithmetic and went a full ahead. We were not equipped for what we found, and we went anyway because no one closer was equipped either, and equipment is not the only variable. 3 Kethrani crew members survived. Havarin survived. The Sarath was not destroyed. BM Kilo 7 is active now, in 2 grids on both sides of that corridor of space, still listening. The captain filed the detour under standard patrol incident reporting. Sector Command annotated it with a commendation citation that I understand he found mildly irritating to process. The last time I saw him, at Verath Point, about 8 months after the Sarath incident, he was in a briefing room with a mug of coffee on the table in front of him. The coffee was cold. He had not touched it. "Still doing that?" I asked. He looked at the mug. "It's a habit," he said. "It's been suggested that it's a bad one." I sat down across from him. "The BM Kilo 7 reactivation," I said. "The recommendation in my after-action report. That was my line." "It was," he said. "I approved it before I filed." "Why?" He looked at me with the same arithmetic expression I had seen in the command chair the day the alert tone sounded. "Because," he said, "if the frequency is listening and there's a vessel close enough and the beacon finds it," he stopped. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it, set the mug down. "Someone should always be listening." That is the whole answer. It is what I would tell Thareth Voss if she asked me again. Standing in the amber emergency light of the docking collar access, with the protocols team working behind her and Havarin stable in our medical bay, and the 2 sealed specimens holding in the cargo section. Someone was listening. We were close. We answered. Those are not 3 separate facts. That is one fact stated 3 times.